Africa's history was filled with a lot of ups and downs. There was a stretch of time where they were rather successful. Some of the most successful sub-Saharan kingdoms were the kingdoms of Central Africa. The earlier kingdom of Kanem-Bornu thrived on the shores of Lake Chad for about 1,000 years, from 800 to 1846. The other Central Kingdom of Africa, the Kingdom of Benin, also thrived in the same area as Kanem-Bornu. The success of these kingdoms can be attributed to their military might, the camel caravans that helped them trade with the East, and the slave trade in later years.
Okay. Egypt, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Sudan, and Tunisia are all a part of North Africa. The climate a long time ago was very moist and like a savanna. Over time, it grew into the desert it is today, very hot and dry. Greeks and Phoenicians settled on the coast because they had great trade there. Carthage controlled most of North Africa. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC. For 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty controlled,
African families were usually extremely large because they practiced polygamy. Polygamy is when...
What's polygamy, Hannah?
Marriage of a husband to more than one wife.
Does that make you uncomfortable?
Keep going! Okay.
Okay, start with polygamy.
Okay. African families were often very large because they practiced polygamy. Polygamy is when
Man marries more than one woman, Hannah.
A man marries more than one woman.
And what does that bring about?
Oh my gosh.
Western Africa. The 3 major kingdoms were Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Each were progressively larger than the next. All these kingdoms had money from gold mines and camel trade, involving gold, salt, and other precious items. The first kingdom was Ghana. They lasted from 700 to 1200 AD. Fanatical Muslims from North Africa attacked and fatally weakened Ghana in the 11th century, but they couldn't conquer. The second kingdom was Mali. They existed from 1200 to 1580 AD. Their most famous ruler is Mansa Musa. He was an extremely rich king who encouraged learning, and his philosophy attracted many scholars. He was superior to the commoners, and he was always hidden behind a curtain, and no one could even see him eat. He proved perfection has its flaws. If he became ill, he was expected to kill himself or be smothered to death. The third kingdom is Songhai. Songhai overthrew Mali in the 15th century. This kingdom expanded farther than Ghana and Mali from the Atlantic to Lake Chad. Songhai had more money than they had power. Songhai met its end in 1591 when the Moroccans invaded.
The trade with Asia was a main economy in Eastern Africa. People from Asia sailed across the Indian Ocean to trade with the city-states in East Africa. The Asia and East Africa created the Swahili society. They exported goods such as gold, iron, and ivory. Trade flourished until the Portuguese arrived and destroyed the city-states.
East Africa was centered around the Horn of Africa. One of the first major kingdoms of East Africa were the Puntites, who were around with ancient Egypt. Around 1000 BC, a peoples from the interior called the Bantu expanded out towards the coast and spread agriculture to the Eastern African people. Around 100 AD, the Kingdom of Axum was founded. It was centered around Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. Axum was primarily a trading empire and traded things like ivory, slaves, and gold. Eventually, the Arabic people and the Persian people began mixing and colonizing Africa. They worked with the East Africans to get people who were further in on the interior, and they enslaved those people and then sold them. So the East Africans were doing decently. They weren't being enslaved, the other people were. Later on, the Arabics and Persians established trade routes with the East Africans. Even later on, people such as the Portuguese and more Arabs began colonizing and suppressing the native African. Although the Arabs were Islamic, they did not spread the Islamic religion to the Eastern Africans, but instead the Eastern Africans retained their native religion.
African culture. African culture is centered on tight-knit communities rather than kingdoms or empires. These tight-knit communities were often extremely large because they practiced polygamy. Polygamy is when a husband marries more than one wife. These families believed in a large variety of religions, but these religions eventually evolved into superstitions. The majority of African people believed in tribal religions. These tribal religions often were centered around a high god who ruled over many lesser gods and the dead ancestors of the Africans. African families relied on herding and farming to provide for their families. The main staple of African culture was trade.
Yeah.
And now, African dad jokes. Wait, how am I doing this? Wait, how am I going to do this? So how am I going to do this? And now, African dad jokes.
African, you're not? Yeah. Hannah, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of Africa?
Pilots.
Why?
What do you call a black pilot?
What?
A pilot. Don't be racist.
Africa is the best. Africa's the best! Uh-huh! Uh-huh. Yeah, get that right.